Hey everyone, welcome to Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. We're coming to you as always, courtesy of our broadcasting partner, moretalk.tv. This week on the show, I'm honored to welcome Loyd Auerbach. Loyd is the Director of the Office of Paranormal Investigations and President of the Forever Family Foundation. He has been in the field for over 35 years, focusing on education and field investigation. He is the author of 9 books, including his latest co-authored release entitled ESP Wars East and West. Loyd is also a professor at Atlantic University and JFK University, as well as teaching online courses through the Rhine Education Center. He is also on the board of on the board of trustees at the Rhine Research Center and the advisory boards of the Windbridge Institute and the Forever Family Foundation. Loyd is a featured presenter at the upcoming A.R.E. conference here in Virginia Beach, and this conference is entitled Breakthroughs Towards a New Consciousness, Science, Spirituality, and the Limitless Mind. This takes place here in Virginia Beach from March 27th through the 29th. Loyd's presentation will be centered on the topic of how pop culture, literature, and the media have influenced our ideas of what consciousness is. To register for this and other conferences offered here at the Association for Research and Enlightenment, you can visit us at our website at edgarcayce.org/conferences. And if you'd like to learn more about Loyd and his work, you can visit his personal website at mindreader.com. Loyd, thank you so much for joining us today on Reflections.
Oh, you're very welcome.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
And I'd like to get started with an introduction question of, I'm curious, how did you first get introduced to the work of Edgar Cayce and the A.R.E.?
Well, I ran across Edgar Cayce's work probably in the A.R.E. probably when I was a very young teenager just getting into parapsychology. I was 12 or 13 when I started looking for books on the subject at the library and really discovered that there was a science behind studying psychic phenomena, and Cayce's work was part of that.
Absolutely. And what kind of brought you into this field of parapsychology? You say you were interested as a teenager, but what brought you into it as a professional within the field?
Well, actually, it was part of that. When I was very young, I was very interested in psychic experiences, psychic phenomena, and when I started reading books about Cayce, but merely books by J.B. Rhine and other folks in the field, I focused my attention in high school on that. I actually started a parapsychology club in my high school, which was pretty successful for a few years, and really intended to get into the field after college. So a lot of what I did was kind of like derived and aimed at that. I was very fortunate that as I was finishing up college, they were just starting a graduate program in parapsychology at John F. Kennedy University here in California, and so timing was actually everything for me.
Right. And can you tell our listeners a bit about what it means to you and what your career has entailed as a parapsychologist?
Well, I've mainly focused on 2 areas. I'm very well known for doing ghost and poltergeist investigations, so kind of the Ghostbuster guy. And that's partly because of publicity I got when I was at JFK University. After I graduated, I worked at the American Society for Psychical Research in New York for a couple of years, then back out to JFK. And that was at around the time that Ghostbusters came out. So we were the real life Ghostbusters, and that led to my first book being published. So I've focused a lot of my work on field investigations because that's really been much more interesting to me than laboratory research, although I do keep on top of that as well. The other area is education, and I have been an educator in this field since I came back to JFK in '83. I have taught courses, accredited courses, both graduate, undergraduate courses, and a lot of non-academic classes. And of course, I'm teaching one course through Atlantic University called Principles of Parapsychology, which is a graduate level course.
And can you tell us a little bit about what it was like being kind of a pioneer in the field of being a parapsychology educator, and also how you tied in your experience as a paranormal investigator? How did that all tie together?
Well, in many respects, I don't really consider myself a pioneer because while, I know a lot of people call me that, especially in the ghost hunting world, which is kind of ridiculous since there's 100 years behind me in that. But I really, I was one of many people who were on faculty at JFK in the year 1980s. John Palmer, who's with the Ryan Research Center in Durham, North Carolina, was actually the chair of the department and ran the parapsychology program in its inception for a couple of years. And we had a number of other parapsychologists and folks connected to the field who were my teachers, in fact. But as I got into it, it was pretty clear that this was something I really liked to do. There were a number of other people like Jerry Salfin and Julian Isaacs who were also very good educators in the subject. And I just kind of stuck with it because I enjoy teaching. I really do enjoy teaching. The bringing the ghost investigation stuff in was kind of an interesting thing. I guess I succeeded Scott Rogo at Fate magazine in 1991. D. Scott Rogo, who was a great researcher and writer on the subject, he was murdered in 1990. And I was actually asked to take over his column about a year and a half later. And that started kind of bringing my ghost hunting stuff together with a lot of the other subject matter. But I'd already written a book on psychic dreams and was in the midst of writing a book on reincarnation, channeling, and possession. So for me, the investigations are very interesting, are the best thing for me to do. But I love teaching people and bringing them to the field of parapsychology, to the science that's there.
Right. And I guess if I may play devil's advocate for a moment, from a skeptic's perspective, I'm sure you get a lot of people who come up to you with kind of a skeptic consciousness. How do you talk to them about this idea of it being a science, there being a science behind psychic phenomena? How do you present that idea to them?
Well, we are studying, in parapsychology, we study psychic experiences. So we're studying experiences of people. Now, you can say that they're not psychic, they're not ESP, they're not psychokinesis, they're not really seeing ghosts or experience that sort. You can say all that, but the fact is that we're studying human experiences that, for want of better terms and better explanations, those are the explanations or the models that we're working with right now. We have actually eliminated people's experiences from that grouping because we're studying the experiences. And we are a social science like psychology in that sense, but we're really studying how consciousness itself directly interacts with other people, with the environment, beyond the use of just the body. So there are legitimate questions to be asked here. And the most legitimate question to me is, well, millions of people have these experiences. Aren't they worth studying? And that's the response I typically have. And what's interesting is the response from skeptics, depending on who they are and really their faith, because it really boils down to true disbelief in the potential for this. Their responses to that are all over the map. Fortunately, some of them are actually make the point, I guess that makes sense. Right. What's also interesting is that I love to ask people in the physical sciences who are very disbelieving, I guess you could say biased against the subject, about parapsychology. They say parapsychology is not a science, and I flat out ask them, is psychology a science? And what's interesting is 9 out of 10 times from physical scientists, they say no, it's not a science. So if they don't consider psychology a science, I'm okay with them not considering parapsychology a science.
Right. And do you see kind of this movement of, for me personally, as I look around at what's going on socially, I come from a sociology background, and I noticed that there seems to be this growing trend of people are much more interested in what psychology has to say and what parapsychology can touch on, and how far we can kind of go with the question of what is consciousness. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the question of what is consciousness is a central question to science right now. It's certainly incredibly important to us in parapsychology. And of course, you have a very philosophical split in science. On the one side, you have rational empiricism, materialism. So pretty much that we are just kind of meat robots. And on the other, that there's something more to that. And actually, at our Parapsychological Association convention last summer, it was put in a panel not as dualism, which is often what's talked about, that it's mind and body, but as pluralism, that there may be, multiple levels of consciousness in and outside the body.
Right. That's wonderful. And what has your research told us about kind of where this idea of consciousness and where this research is going to go in the future? Is this going to be something that's totally going to shift our perspective as a society? And is this a growing trend that you see continuing to gain momentum?
I think it's gaining momentum actually on both sides. We see a lot more and more in the neurosciences trying to explain away consciousness, find parts of the brain. And yet, every so often, there's a neuroscientist who pops up and a physicist who pops up and says, wait a minute, this data does not fully explain everything that's going on. So I'm very encouraged that they are doing more and more work on the brain and its limitations as well as its functioning. On the other side, there's so many different people who have so many different ideas about consciousness. We just have to be open to whatever the evidence shows. And
Right.
experientially, in people's experiences, we are seeing that there are some phenomena of consciousness that just don't get explained away by what we see in the brain. Uh, in
Right.
my field, there's more and more research being done with spirit mediums, and from a scientific perspective. So we know that there's something definitely going on different in their brains. The question is, are they communicating with someone outside themselves, or they're being purely psychic and picking up information? And we're still having to determine that. But the fact that it's happening, that research is going on from not just the interview process or observation, but also bringing in brain science, neuroscience into this process is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And in talking about this growing interest that's going on both in the scientific community and, of course, elsewhere in society, Casey was known to say that everyone can has psychic abilities. Everybody can do what I do
Right.
with the proper practice and the proper training. I guess in saying that, what do you tell people who come to you that are very interested in this and want to say, maybe they'll tell you, I want more psychic ability. I want to experience more of the paranormal in my life. What do you tell somebody like that?
Well, actually, I teach a course. I've actually taught it in a couple of different places, which includes a bit on psychic development. We've learned an awful lot in the laboratory, as well as observationally in parapsychology, about what makes people more psychic. Whether it's altered states, inductions, whether it's relaxation as part of that, whether it's just accepting and noticing that you already are psychic. We've learned a lot, and
Right.
we can help people actually find their niche. The thing that's interesting is that Casey and J.B. Ryan actually also said the same thing. Everybody has a little bit of psychic ability. The question is, where's your aptitude? What are you going to be good at? So maybe everybody can't be like Edgar Casey because they have a different aptitude for doing some other psychic ability. And part of the process for psychic development is figuring out what you're good at. What do your experiences already show you're good at? And how do you develop that?
Right. And you've touched a number of times on the Rhine Institute. And for the listeners who may
Mhm.
not be familiar, can you give us a little bit of background of both what that institute was established for and your role within that institute?
Sure. Well, in the 1930s, people might remember that there was a connection with Duke University and parapsychology. And in the early 1930s, a researcher, a psychologist named William McDougall brought two young students of his, J.B. Ryan and Louisa Ryan, to Duke University, and they took over the work in parapsychology and really ramped it up in the mid 30s. They established a laboratory in 1935, and when Ryan retired in 1965, he moved the lab off campus, still keeping it in Durham, originally called the Institute for Parapsychology at the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. And that was renamed the Ryan Research Center in the late 1980s, which is what it is today. A few years ago, the Ryan also established an education area. So they have a Ryan Education Center, which is an online school. So my role actually, I was originally on the advisory board. I'm on the board of directors now, and I'm one of the couple of main instructors for online courses for the Ryan Education Center. I just actually started a course on the science of ESP this past Wednesday, which people can still register for. And I'm in the middle of an investigations class right now, and then we'll be doing an online introduction to parapsychology course later this spring, in fact. So the Ryan does research today on various types of psychic phenomena, including healing related research, and still publishes the Journal of Parapsychology and does a number of other educational things in the Durham area as well as online.
Wonderful. Thank you. And the one thing you brought up towards the end there was this idea of healing. And I think this is a huge part of what people are most interested in because probably because people just don't quite understand how parapsychology and ESP can be used for healing. So can you give us a brief kind of introduction into how that all ties together? Because I know Casey talked about thoughts being things, and that's kind of a
Right.
foundation of what this is all about.
Well, other than studying life after death, which is a part of what parapsychology studies. We study extrasensory perception, which is information flow, and we study also something called psychokinesis, mind over matter, which we often call mind-matter interaction. And so healing is actually using energy or using one's thoughts, intention, to actually cause an effect in someone else's body, or for that matter, in your own body. You can do self-healing as well psychically, and that's psychokinesis. It also involves ESP, because you can think of ESP as the targeting system to figure out what's wrong with somebody and where to put that energy or that impact or that effect. So, research on psychic healing has been going on for quite some time in our field, and it's definitely something that people in our field are interested in. The Rhine Center actually is looking at kind of some old ideas, which is that healers give off energy and give off light. And so they're doing research with biophotons being given off by healers while they're doing their healing.
Wow, that's amazing. Good to hear. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
I guess in talking about all these wonderful topics, and for some people they may be a little out there, it causes you to really stretch your mind around what you perceive as truth. I guess what are some of the most common misconceptions that you come across and that you have noticed the general public may hold within their conscious?
Well, there's a variety of misconceptions. One of which is that psychics have, and I guess this falls to belief. People go to see psychics because they want their future predicted for them, and they seem to think that psychics can actually do that, and psychics can do that, but pretty much no better than the weather guys. So the further out you predict something, the less about somebody's life, the less likely it's going to be true. Just like the further out you predict the weather, the less likely it's going to be true. We do know that precognition works. Right. There's support for it, even in physics at the quantum level. But the idea that we can predict an accurate future, especially after giving someone that information, they can go out and change it. So there's this misconception about fate, I guess you could say, that we have determined. There are misconceptions about claims of psychics. A lot of it is around the practitioners and not around us, not around the researchers. And I think the biggest connection here is that people will often accept what a lot of psychics say, which are very sincere beliefs, but they haven't studied any of this stuff. They haven't even asked questions about their own abilities, and they'll overlay that on top of what parapsychology, how parapsychology is approaching things. We also have,
Right.
people from the skeptical side saying that our research is crappy, that we are not controlled, that we actually have no evidence. And the fact is that we have a lot of evidence. We have some of the best controlled experiments in science, and that's been actually pointed out by people from outside the field who have come in skeptically looking at what we can do to find where we're wrong in terms of our research and the methods themselves. And have been, while they don't agree necessarily with the conclusions, they have been surprised to find how good and how much better our controls are than most other fields of science, especially in social science. So we're kind of battling it's an uphill battle with the organized skeptic movement, and it is an organized skeptics movement that's out there trying to kind of poo-poo all this stuff. And then for me, the ghost, the whole ghost hunting thing on TV creates all sorts of misconceptions. We don't investigate in the dark in the middle of the night, especially if the phenomena is being experienced during the middle of the day. That makes no sense whatsoever. People are terrible observers with the lights out, so we don't do lights out investigations either. The equipment that's used on TV, none of it can detect ghosts, even though they say it does. It can be used to detect changes in the environment. We correlate or connect those to people's experiences. And you can't, unlike the TV shows, we are interested in the ghost story. We want to hear from the people who have the experiences. It's not about us going in with a lot of equipment and being spooked. That just makes, it's not even scientific. It just makes no sense whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I know there's definitely a lot of misconceptions out there, and I've always been a bit bugged about how this whole idea of ESP and parapsychological investigation really seems to be twisted within Hollywood and the mainstream media. So
Well,
thank you for
yeah, I
clarifying
mean,
that.
how Hollywood, fiction has taken almost everything and expanded on it. I actually have no problem with a well-written script that takes a kernel of truth or something and expands on it. I really don't. So I guess you could say I have less trouble with science fiction than horror a lot of times, because at least science fiction tends to extrapolate what if, whereas horror basically says, well, that's not interesting enough, it's not scary enough, let's completely change it.
Right, right, absolutely. And a more personal question is, as you've been in this field for decades, how has it helped to shape your personal view of your life, and how do you see your life's work kind of having an impact on both you personally and then in your community that you're working with?
Well, I have a personal philosophy about life and death. I'm actually I do believe in life after death. I'm not in a hurry to get there. I also know that we're here for a reason, whatever that reason happens to be, and so I'm not in a rush. And it's really impacted me. Just when I hear from people who say that they've had an impact, they've read my books or they've heard me on the radio or something else, and that struck a chord with them, whether it is getting them interested in doing work in this field or whether it is helping them with their experiences. And I actually really am happy to hear that the work that I do sometimes helps people actually understand and stop being afraid of their experiences, because that's really what I've tried to do over the years, is try to remove the fear that people have in their experiences, whether they're ghostly experiences or ESP experiences, and really consider that these are normal experiences. They're not paranormal. They're actually normal experiences, especially if we go by the numbers of people that have had these experiences.
Right,
And I
absolutely.
take a, it's interesting when people meet me and I tell them what I do, and I do tell people what I do. It doesn't take them long to find out that I'm a pretty normal guy and I use a lot of common sense approach to this. And I think the most important thing is to know that there's something really here. It's a mystery, regardless of whether we're right or not in parapsychology. We could be completely wrong, but so far nobody in science is right either. So I feel
Right,
that it's important to look at these questions, and the questions of what ESP is or what these experiences say to us, what life about life after death. They say that we're more than what the world tells us we are. In other words, there's more to humanity. There's more to being human than just what we think there is. And we keep expanding that. And that's what really keeps me interested.
yeah, absolutely, me too. I think it's a wonderful time to be alive, to get to see all of this really coming up to the surface more so than I think it has in the past.
Right.
But we're gonna have to take a quick commercial break. But I'd love to talk more about this when we get back. We'll talk more with Loyd Auerbach here on Reflections: The Wisdom of Edgar Casey. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Reflections: The Wisdom of Edgar Casey. Joining us today is Loyd Auerbach, and we were talking about a number of things, mostly, based around parapsychology and ESP. Um, Loyd, I want to talk a bit about your upcoming A.R.E conference. I'm really excited about this one, and I know your talk is going to be about pop culture, literature, and the media and how they've kind of influenced our ideas of consciousness. And coming from my background in sociology, this is an incredibly fascinating topic to me. Can you tell us a little bit about what conference attendees can expect to take away from your presentation?
Well, I always find it interesting. You were asking about misconceptions before, and a lot of our misconceptions, almost modern folklore, comes from the folklore, and our folklore is literature. It's fiction literature. It is for us, it's film and television actually more than anything else. And now, of course, we're getting the internet involved in that whole process. I actually the first time I encountered anything about psychic phenomena was watching TV shows when I was a little kid, probably 3 or 4 years old. My dad worked for NBC, so I had a TV set in my room when I was 2. I was very influenced by this. And so it shows there was a show called Topper, which was an old show about a guy who was haunted by two very playful ghosts, and it was a comedy show. You can still find episodes around. Between that and comic books, and I got to say, we were just talking about what I had said about the limits of human beings and how we set those limits. It was superhero comic books that I got involved in, which I still read, that suggested to me, as science fiction has since then, that humanity, we've limited ourselves. We limit what we can do, we limit what we say we can do, and those things really influence me in terms of understanding that it's okay if we have these experiences. We just have to figure out what they actually are. So my
Right.
presentation is going to be about some key, a number of different bits of literature, that, especially science fiction. I'll be talking about pop culture literature like comic books, and certainly motion pictures and TV, and how they've planted ideas in people's heads, many of which are misconceptions, but others get people thinking about what consciousness might be. I think that one of the only places people probably even encounter the idea of dual consciousness, of kind of mind-body separation, if they don't read into that area or watch or listen to podcasts and shows like yours, is if they read fiction or get the right fiction or TV shows or movies. These ideas are brought to us
Right.
that way, and it gets people thinking. It also, unfortunately, has a negative impact. For example, in the ghost arena, people tend to think that if just because the movie is based on a true story or true event, that this must be a horrible, terrible thing that happens to people all the time. A case in point is the Amityville Horror, which was actually based
Right.
on a book, which was based on a hoax. That the couple made up
Huh.
a lot of the stuff. So you have that kind of impact, and it's long standing, and it actually impacts the media itself. In fact, the misconceptions are also held by people in the media who write this stuff, and by fiction writers who create modern literature.
Right. Absolutely. Well, good. We look forward to
So,
having you here and attending that conference. I wanted to talk a little bit about Casey was well known to see many things, including kind of auras, and he was also seeing entities that other people weren't seeing. In your experience of this, is this something that is going on a lot? I mean, it seems that in your research you found that this is more common than most people like to think, and I guess in saying that as well. It ties in with the media where they portray ghosts and hauntings and poltergeists and things like that in a very specific way. Is that something that you tend to shy away from, or what has your experience shown you how to kind of deal with that situation?
well, I deal with people who have experiences like that all the time. They call, they want to know
Right.
what they mean. They want to know what they can do about it. A lot of people want to shut it down. A lot of adults. I've talked to people whose kids are ostensibly seeing spirits, and they don't know what to do about that. One of the foundations that I'm involved in, the Forever Family Foundation, actually does support of people like that, people who are also grieving, who want to communicate with their loved ones. So we actually support the work of spirit mediums and family grieving, as well as research in life after death work, which is where this all comes into. And it's really interesting. You have a lot of people on TV talking about their experiences. Producers change the experiences to make them negative. There are a number of shows I've been contacted with. They want real experiences, but most experiences people actually have, if they start asking a couple of questions, they're not negative at all. I think that in one of the things I'll talk a little bit about at the conference is that in the history of film and TV, generally ghosts are shown as humans, and usually in a dramatic or comedic way. It's rarely fearful or fear-inducing. Now, that's different than the demon type mythology that they bring in. But in reality, when people experience these things, I talk to them, they say, what do I do? I see a ghost. I'm seeing ghosts. I said, well, have you asked them why they're here? Have you asked them what you can do for them? And I get usually this blank stare or dead silence on the phone. Like, I can ask them questions. And really, this is an opportunity. I usually tell them this is a great opportunity. You're talking to someone who potentially may be deceased. Ask them what it's like. Wouldn't you be interested in finding
Right.
that out? And when you switch it to really play on their curiosity, most people lose the fear right away. And I think
Right.
that's really kind of a key factor here for we're dealing with people's experiences. These are things you should ask questions about, not things you should run from.
Right. Absolutely. And as your role as an educator, you've been doing that for a long time, and dare I say, a pioneer in the field. But what has been the most rewarding thing about educating people about this and kind of putting away their misconceptions and helping to work with them through this? What's been the most rewarding thing for you personally?
Well, one of the most rewarding things is seeing some of my students over the years really get involved in the field. A couple of my colleagues now, just like my professors that saw me get into the field, a couple of my colleagues today are people who took courses from me or have gone on and do some parapsychology education themselves or worked in research in one way, shape, or form. And that makes me feel great. Hearing, really communicating with people down the road who have a handle on their experiences, some of whom actually learn to be a little bit more psychic. That's been very, very rewarding. And actually, of late, I've even been mentoring a few mediums So who actually are very interested in understanding what their experiences mean and and what their abilities are. And it's a really interesting thing. Over the last probably 5 years, I've worked with a lot of psychics and a lot of mediums, and I find that mediums, maybe because they're dealing with people, dead people, but they're still dealing with people. Where psychics are picking up information, even though they're picking it up from people, they're picking it up from other things. But psychics are less curious about their abilities than the mediums actually are. The mediums are really curious about the process, and that's a really interesting thing. So that's something to bring into the education work that I do when I work with people as well. That's been very rewarding.
Absolutely. Yeah, great. I want to kind of shift gears and talk a little bit about your latest book. It's titled
Yeah.
ESP Wars. And can you tell us a little bit about the process of how this book came about and what the readers can expect to come across while reading this book?
Sure. Well, I mean, the book is I'm the third author on the book. I was brought into the project by Edwin May. So it's Edwin C. May is the main author. Victor Rubel is the second author on the book. And Ed was the project director for our U.S. government psychic research effort called the Stargate program from 1985 to 1995, which is when it was shut down and actually became public knowledge. That's when it was revealed to have existed for over 20 years. People may have heard the names Targ and Puthoff, and they did some of the early remote viewing work. And for the most part, that's what the project was about, using the ability of ESP called remote viewing to pick up on locations and people outside the United States, typically, although sometimes in the U.S., psychic spying, basically. And there have been books written by some of the practitioners, some of the folks who were remote viewers themselves in the program. This is the first time, two things. Number one, Ed tells his story, which is a story of kind of how the program even got started, why it even was started by the U.S. government, and how it evolved over the years, and why it shut down and hasn't been resurrected. I mean, there's a lot of politics in there. But the other thing about this book is that Ed and Victor actually made inroads into Russia in the early 1990s. And they got to know some of the Russians who were doing the research there on remote viewing. And since that time, actually, since our program shut down and theirs shut down, there's been a lot more communication, in fact. So we have, for the first time ever, firsthand accounts from several of the individuals who ran the psychic research program since the 1960s in the Soviet Union and Russia subsequently, as well as a few of the psychics who were involved in that. That's never appeared in print before. And what's cool for me, when Ed brought me in, because the book was a collection of articles and chapters from these various individuals, and I was brought in to kind of bring it together, to really make it a narrative that people would find very interesting and read. And I was personally surprised at some of the accounts from some of the Russians, because they're ex-KGB, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff about the KGB and Soviet politics, about personalities like Gorbachev and Yeltsin from the perspective of people in that government, and how that related to psychic functioning and psychic phenomena. And it's really fascinating. It was fascinating for me to find out, for example, that during the Chechen War, the the Russians had put psychics that they had trained, remote viewers were put in the tanks on the front lines.
Oh,
And they were
wow.
used to help. They were used to help them avoid any trouble with the rebels at that point.
Right.
Although
Right.
it's some really cool stuff in there, and it's been very eye-opening for me. And I've actually now involved in a project with Ed. He has a publisher interested in publishing the best of the archives, the declassified archives from the project, from the Stargate project. So we're going to be culling through 80,000 pages to kind of create 8 to 10 volumes of the best material for that.
Wow. Yeah, excellent. Look forward to that.
Yeah.
In talking about this topic, it seems that these topics were a bit more taboo in the past, and some of the I guess when you talk about confidential government knowledge seems to kind of be seeping up through the cracks more now than ever. That could just be
Yeah.
my perception, but it's just what I notice as I look around, what people are into on the internet, what people are pursuing as far as books and research. And I guess you could take it two ways, and I see it happening amongst the people around me. Is that some people are becoming very afraid of what's coming up, and they're learning kind of the secrets of what the government has been interested in, the research that's been done, and then other people are using it to kind of empower themselves with the knowledge and
Right.
self empowerment. What are your thoughts on this kind of movement, this idea that's going on right now?
Well, the issue is that we are finding out a lot more. I guess we could have a lot more whistleblowers within the government in terms of what the U.S. government's doing. But the one thing that's really important to know, it's not the government; it's people in the government. We people always ask if there's a conspiracy to hide stuff about UFOs. It's like, well, there might be, but it could be five guys. It doesn't mean that it's the entire government, and it's highly unlikely because the government is very dysfunctional. That's the other thing that looking into any of this stuff, it's been very dysfunctional. While there was an interest both in the U.S. and the Soviet Union in doing mind control and telepathic influence and all that, they found it didn't work. And so what's really interesting is if you really look into the material and look into what's been going on, you find that the ideas have popped up, but in practice, they didn't quite work the way that perhaps people are afraid that they worked. And we have a lot of paranoia and fear about people in power. This is, normal human nature, actually, I think, especially when you have secrets. And there are naturally going to be secrets in any government because of societal issues and people doing the wrong thing, unethical behavior. And that gets applied in all sorts of areas. And, I think what the internet's done, though, is kind of brought the people who are a little more paranoid and not clinically paranoid, but really like to talk about ideas like this, brings them together, and that kind of feeds the fire in all aspects. Not to say that there's not something
Right.
to be worried about here and there, but as we know, but it does feed the flames.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a number of people out there who are helping to feed the flames themselves. They're taking this and they're trying to get everybody involved and get them worried. But my
Yeah.
personal opinion is, yeah, take care of your own and you'll be okay. There's plenty of great stuff out there and wonderful research like yours that's coming out that really helps to empower us. And I think that's the more powerful way to use it all.
Yeah, I'm personally I'm less worried about the secret government projects than I am worried about Congress and its ineffectiveness.
Correct, correct. I want to kind of get back to the Casey material. Casey made a number of predictions. We talked about this previously before we took the break about kind of future predictions and how psychics are very big into predicting the future. Casey had a wonderful, I guess, idea that he had brought to the surface that he said he made many predictions for the future, but he always made it very clear that the determining factor as to whether these predictions take place is free will, individual free
Right.
will, and also collective free will within a society.
Right.
What are your thoughts on this, and how have you seen this play out in your research in the field?
Well, I think that that statement right there, that's the most important thing to remember, is that even though there's actually a model that's been growing in some areas of parapsychology that a lot of ESP actually is precognition. Precognition is kind of the main thing. Uh, but what we find is that there are so many influences. Psychic sits down and reads the future, and to kind of paraphrase the great Jedi Master Yoda, the future is always in motion. We have, at any given moment, if you knew everything in the world, if you were omniscient and knew what was going on right now, you could make, without being psychic otherwise, in terms of precognitive, you could make some pretty damn good guesses about what's going to happen next to almost everybody if you had all that information
Hmm.
there. But then all it takes is somebody
Yeah.
to say, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And that creates a domino effect that changes things. So you can take information. And one of the things we've learned in parapsychology, there's kind of a paradox here. It's called the intervention paradox, that you're given information about what the future is going to be like. And you may decide or do something either to bring it about or to do something that could cause it to fall apart. And that is kind of like the models of the weather. When you do weather prediction, the reason why the further things go out, the harder it is to predict the weather is because there can be something that you didn't account for happening elsewhere in the world, like an earthquake or a volcano or something else, something man-made that starts a domino effect, kind of like the butterfly effect. And it just simply may have not a major effect on things here, but it has a minor effect. And it's enough to kick things off kilter. So it really is about using the information from those predictions to do what needs to be done or not do what needs to be done to make things come true. One of the psychics I worked with years ago used to tell her clients that you want to know what's going to happen for you in the next 2 months. Okay, today I'm going to tell you what I see. You come back a month later, and depending on how you've used this information, I'm possibly going to give you a completely different idea of what's going to happen.
Right.
And yet we also
Right.
have kind of more general trends. Psychics can be right on trends in people's lives and even world events to some extent. Because some
Yeah,
things are building up,
absolutely.
and that's what they're picking up on.
Right. It's kind of, I guess you call it probabilities, and we're kind of the determining factor, both as individuals and
Right.
as groups, societies.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Personally, the
absolutely.
way I see precognition is that we're picking up on the most likely future, the most
Hmm.
probable future. But we can
Right.
change that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an empowering message for sure. As kind of a conclusive question, I just wanted to ask you, pose kind of, I guess, play devil's advocate again. It
Mhm.
would be if someone were to come to you and say, why should I be interested in these topics? Why should I care about ESP? Why should I care about psychic phenomena? Why should I care about parapsychology and the nature of consciousness? All that entails. Why is it important that we know about it, we educate ourselves about it, and that we kind of pursue it as an individual interest and an individual practice?
Well, there's two sides to that question. One is the greater question of understanding human beings in general. So then, you might as well ask that question about why psychology. There's practical applications of psychology and a lot of theoretical stuff. You might ask that question about a lot of theoretical physics. Why do we have a Large Hadron Collider in at the CERN in Switzerland? Well, why is that there? Because we're trying to look at the bigger questions. But on the personal level, because these experiences can be part of your life, it's helpful to understand what these experiences might mean and how to harness the information you get or ignore them. It's up to you how you want to deal with that. And there are practical applications of ESP. I mean, we've seen that with some psychics who work with police. We see that with psychics who work with archaeologists, with the remote viewing program, actually, for the governments, the various governments. There are practical applications. Information is power. And that's one of the reasons why we want to know about ESP is how to tap into that source of information that is beyond the use of our normal senses that might help us both on a day-to-day basis, but also throughout our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And I think you raised a great point. You said that it's something that we are likely going to experience some form of this in our life. And I think it's
Right.
also important. It can help create a more compassionate society in that if we were to educate ourselves and become more open-minded about the topics, we may have a friend or a loved one who's going through this a little more intensely than we might be, and we can be there to help them kind of cope with what they're going through and give them a better explanation of what's going on.
Yeah, I think one of the scariest things about my field is that it suggests very strongly that we are more connected than we want to be.
Right.
And we have to take personal
Absolutely.
responsibility for our thoughts, which is a whole nother thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you kind of explain, I guess for our listeners, when you talk about taking more responsibility for your thoughts, what does that entail, and what is that practice all about?
Well, I think it really means, as you mentioned, the word compassion. We need to be, kind to people. It's not. People say sticks and stones will break your bones, but names will never hurt you. That's actually not true. We all know that.
Right.
That negative emotion directed at people can be felt by people. That's a form of empathy, or it is a form of ESP. And what we're finding in psychokinesis research is that human beings do affect things unconsciously quite a bit, including our own technology. When we're in bad moods, sometimes our phones and computers start acting up on us. So when I say taking more
Yes.
responsibility, that just means be mindful. You know, um, Obviously, people are going to run into situations where they get angry, where they think hurtful thoughts about people, but just know that those thoughts could be potentially felt by folks, and don't get upset if somebody gets upset because you're upset. I think it's really
Yeah.
about knowing that there is that connection and not taking everything personally is the key factor here, because some of what you take personally is really in relation to people picking up on your own emotions.
Right. Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, Loyd, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. It's been a pleasure chatting with you about all these various topics, and I want to personally thank you for being such a powerful educator with a message that's very much needed now. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Don't miss your chance to see Loyd, as he is a featured presenter at the upcoming A.R.E conference here in Virginia Beach, entitled Breakthroughs Towards a New Consciousness: Science, Spirituality, and the Limitless Mind. And this conference takes place from March 27th through the 29th, and you can register on our website at edgarcayce.org/conferences. On behalf of everyone here at the Association for Research and Enlightenment and MoreTalk.tv, I'm your host, Brenton Bickerstaff. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the show, and I hope everyone has a wonderful week. I'll see you next week. And now it is time for the thought for the day here on Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. And joining me as always on Reflections for the thought for the day is Dr. Bill Austin. Bill, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Greetings, Brent. Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And if you can go ahead, and read the thought for the day for our listeners today.
I'd be happy to. This thought comes from reading 5756-14. Love goes far beyond what you have called the grave. Love goes far beyond what you have called the grave. You know, years ago, and this is back in the mid-70s, I went to a Cayce function and met a fellow by the name of George Ritchie, who had a near-death experience, and he wrote a small book about it, and then I read a lot of work by Raymond Moody, and it seems like back then this was really new stuff. And now, if you go to Barnes & Noble's, you'll find a whole rack of near-death experience, beyond the grave type of information. And there's a common thread that you see most of the time, not all of the time, but I'm going to say 99% of the time. And that there is this unbelievable feeling of love and safety. Cayce talked about death being going through the door into just another realm that can be very enjoyable. You know, I read this and say, boy, not long ago, not many people had even thought along those lines. And now it's almost an everyday thought, which is wonderful, you know. And so often I see the world manifesting some of the ideas and concepts that Cayce talked about, you know, so many years ago, you know, almost 100 years ago. And now they're everyday thoughts. You can talk to anybody about this, and they'll say, oh yeah, did you read this book or that book? Have you heard about this experience? And it's wonderful. It's like it's all coming alive. Enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You raise a wonderful point, and it was actually a conversation I was having just last night, so there's a nice synchronicity here. I was having this conversation with my friend about the Cayce material, and we dove really deep into it, and we were talking about exactly that, about how the Cayce material is truly coming alive right now. And you hear it talked about amongst so many communities and circles of friends who, and especially if you pay attention to social media right now, there's this very large movement taking place on social media that's a metaphysical, a spiritual, and the application of all these principles. And people are working with each other through social media to help each other and support each other and bounce back ideas about what it's like when you apply these principles. And these principles that I refer to are all of the principles that formed the foundation of the thousands of readings that came out of the Cayce material. And it's truly it's so awe-inspiring for us to be alive at this time and to get to see the work that Casey and the soul group that revolved around Casey and put dedicated their lives, especially Gladys Davis, to documenting this and organizing it and making it available to the masses, so that when it
Yeah,
does come time for it to come to fruition, which is right now, we're living in that time, it's all available to everybody. And for us to be able to sit back and just say, I've been a part of this, and this is part of my life, and this is what my life is all about. It's about ideals. It's about putting this stuff into practice, and again, sharing it with other people like we're doing now. It's truly a very powerful and awe-inspiring experience. But to get to the actual reading, love goes far beyond what you have called the grave. This reminds me immediately of the life readings that came out of the Casey material, because what came out of the life readings to me is one of the most fascinating aspects to not only the people that were actually getting the readings at the time, but for us who get to study it later on in life. Because the connections, and what he specifically addresses love in this reading. And I think, of course, so many people talk about how love is the foundation, the glue that holds everything together, and it truly does go beyond the grave. Because in the life readings, Casey connected so many dots for people, talking about their past life experiences and how the relationships that existed in previous lives, that love connection that was made, that feeling that you have for somebody where you just don't want to let them go, when you pass on to the grave, you very often get to come back and you get to remanifest that love connection with that same soul in another lifetime. And it's a constant cycle, because not only does this cycle happen, as Casey says, to learn the lessons and make the spiritual progress that you need to make, but you get the reward of getting to experience that love, that connection that you made in a previous sojourn, in a previous experience. You get to pick right back up where you left off, and you truly do pick right back up where you left off. That feeling is always there, and that's why
hmm
I love this excerpt.
yeah, and you bring up a good point. If you study the Casey readings at all, you know that these bodies just seem to come and go. But the opportunity for that soul growth, to experience that love with another individual, that can be shared with one individual, many individuals, that stems from the love that created us. That
Right.
never changes, never dies, and certainly doesn't end with the grave. And all these experiences that people are having and starting to come forth with are saying there is a love like no other that is beyond the grave, as we quote know the grave, but we also know that these lives are just going to continue to come and go, so that we can get to the point where we can really deeply experience that love, not when we're dead, but when we're alive right now. And the Casey readings talk about, really, there is no death. There may be a different realm, but there is no death. There is no death because that love never dies.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful. This has been one of my favorite thoughts for the day. I really like this reading, and I really like what we've been able to manifest through it. So thank you, Bill, as always, for sharing your wisdom with us.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you, Brent. I really appreciate it. Have a
Yeah, my
wonderful week.
pleasure. You too. I'll see you next
Thanks.
week.
I look forward to it. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.